Red Bull gives you wings, as the marketing strapline goes. Certainly Red Bull has had the ability to give wings to several nondescript football clubs you might never have otherwise heard of. From the MetroStars to Austria Salzburg to SSV Markranstadt. But have they given football the wings to fly away from tradition and community that it was founded on to create something rotten to the core? How does a Thai energy drink called Krating Daeng become synonymous with football? We've got the middleman of Dietrich Mateschitz to thank after he brought the drink to Austria 9 years after its Asian launch, and by 1994 they were selling 1 million cans a day in Germany upon launch before, 11 years later, they made their first dent into football. In 2005 they acquired Austria Salzburg, a team that has its history in a 1933 merger of Salzburg clubs that has appeared in the UEFA Cup final as recently as 1994. When Red Bull picked them up, they were busy surviving relegation from the Austrian Bundesliga. 9 days after a club AGM declared that the club wouldn't be tampered with, Red Bull changed the club's crest, its colours to white, red and yellow that have become synonymous with the brand, before announcing they were a whole new club. Forget those 6 Austrian championships and a UEFA Cup final beforehand. Whilst rebranding wasn't a new thing for Salzburg football, they were after all called Casino Salzburg when they lost that UEFA Cup final to Inter Milan in 1994, but this one prompted hate from the fans. Their colours had been whitewashed, their history was busy being whitewashed as well. On the ground floor of this revolution were luminaries such as Franz Beckenbauer, Giovanni Trapattoni and Lothar Matthäus. Rich names from the past for a club and a brand that was all about energy and moving forward. Sure, they'd win leagues. The first would come by a stupid 19 points from SV Ried in 2007. And successors in Kurt Adrianza and Hoop Stevens would cobble together 3 more titles between 2009 and 2011. But it just wasn't making an imprint, or being given wings. Ricardo Moniz led the club to its first Austrian double in 2012. And Salzburg were exactly that, just another team that dominated their own division whilst leaving without a trace on the continent year after year. The doom spiral for lesser European leagues was enacted, and it was here to stay. But Red Bull wanted more. They wanted profitability and self-sustainability as they rifled through managers and kept no patience to the successful coaches they brought to the club, and if they did, they were quickly being picked off by bigger and better clubs. They needed a change. Then they hired Ralf Rangnick to oversee the entire thing. Finally, a football man at the heart of its operations. Red Bull football was expanding rapidly. Would they fail or flourish? But before we answer that, I need to tell you about how I watch every single Premier League match completely legally, which means it's VPN time! A VPN hides your IP address, which lets you safeguard your internet connection. So, the absolute opposite of what the Manchester United defence would do. Am I right? No? Okay. And for those who haven't skipped this YouTube advert because you bloody love a bargain, here's why you should choose private internet access, today's video sponsor. 1. They're offering you an insane 83% VPN discounts and 4, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4 months completely free. See it like Manchester City buying Citigroup players for a knockdown price. 2, you can protect an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. Chelsea's transfer strategy for 1. You want 783 devices protected, just buy them all up and protect them. 3, you can access region-restricted content from all over the world 365 days a year. Good news for Spurs fans whose passports are usually back in that cupboard by December. That is private internet access. Links to the discount in the description. People love to call New York City the centre of the universe, don't they? As far as football was concerned, it was some bumfuck backwater. In 1996, a New York, New Jersey team was made a founding member of MLS. After rejecting Empire Soccer Club as a name, they plumped for the cumbersome New York, New Jersey MetroStars. MetroStars with a capital in the middle of it, just like WrestleMania. Sharing a ground with NFL team New York Giants, they went through all the pitfalls you'd imagine. They'd staple themselves to people like Carlos Queiroz and that man again, Lothar Matthäus, and go through a name change to MetroStars. Then Bob Bradley turned up in 2003, a piss take from British parlance after his time at Swansea, but he was the one to take them to the US Open Cup final, which means something to somebody presumably. Red Bull were planning on launching a new franchise, which is American for football club, but balked at the cost and, crucially, the effort that it would take. Instead, they lobbed $100 million at AEG to turn the MetroStars into New York Red Bulls, because who gives a fuck about New Jersey anyway? So did the ravenous American fanbase attack the Red Bull takeover like fans in Austria had previously done. What do you think? In a more nascent football market, and I rely on my gag reflex to use that word, the reaction to Red Bull's takeover was more mixed. This was effectively a grassroots club in a league that was basically still grassroots. An academy opened up in 2006 would become the best in the country, but Red Bull still relied on big names to steer them through the first choppy waters. Enter Juan Pablo Angel. And yet, the Red Bulls couldn't take over their hiccups when the stakes were raised. They lost to Columbus Crew in the 2008 MLS Cup final. A CONCACAF Champions League defeat to Trinidad outfit W Connection cost Juan Carlos Osorio his job, so Red Bull opened up a purpose-built 25,000-seater stadium, bought Tim Cahill and Thierry Henry to play in it. But football heritage is just that.
Football heritage.
They routinely won the Supporters' Shield, but apparently winning the league doesn't count for anything in America when you've got to boil everything down to a winner-take-all showcase match, which means that every finale is just watered down. When it truly mattered in the Eastern Conference playoffs, the Red Bulls wilted again and again. As I talk to you today, they have still not won the MLS Cup, and they have only appeared in 3 knockout stages of the CONCACAF Champions League. The only thing they've got going for them is talent production, and through the founding of a second team in 2015, the Red Bulls can lay claim to the best academy in the US. And yet, they're probably as bad in the senior game as they've ever been. They routinely qualify for the playoffs, sure, and apparently they're in there for the 2024 season as well. At the time of writing, I don't know whether they've made it 6 first-round defeats out of 6 though. You tell me in the comments. They're at a point now where the fans complain that they should spend more, as they consistently languish amongst the lowest payroll. They've gotten to the point in their adolescence that they want independence. They want to be a bit more than just a feeder club to other Red Bull teams in Europe. By the late 2010s, however, there was a fairly good reason for Red Bull's attention to be focused more on Europe. They just acquired a team within the Big 5 leagues who could be expected to go deep in the Champions League. If anyone tells you that Leipzig has no history as a football city, tell them that actually VfB Leipzig won the first ever German championship in 1903. That club would go on to become Lokomotiv Leipzig, and they got a Cup Winners' Cup final out of it. Of course, this has all faded into the distance thanks to Red Bull, which is famously supposed to heighten your senses, if anything. Given that Red Bull's headquarters were in Austria, it was only a matter of time before they went over the border to Germany. It's a bigger and better football market, and they speak the same language. Fortuna Dusseldorf, 1860 Munich and St. Pauli were all sounded out for potential bases, but were quickly rebuffed. Just imagine a world in which Red Bull St. Pauli exists. German football would have imploded. Football in Eastern Germany was on a nightmarish ski slope of disaster, and by 2009, the Bundesliga officially had no representative from the former DDR when Energy Cottbus got relegated. As such, it was an untapped market, with the massive Zentral Stadion going unused. Red Bull simply had to launch in Leipzig. In such a moral footballing hotbed as Germany, they were naturally going to find rejection. And they did, even from Sachsen, Leipzig and Lokomotiv Leipzig, who occupied the regional leagues. They stood close by, infiltrated the local village Markranstadt and found SSV Markranstadt and lobbed €40,000 in their direction for a playing licence, took 11 of their players, their coach, and to satisfy German rules, pinched a bunch of Sachsen's youth players to get the ball rolling. Everything changed again, colours, crest, but crucially, German rules couldn't change the name to a commercial endeavour, And so we're left with the thinly veiled Rasenball Leipzig. Again, Germany is different. They have something called the 50+1 rule, which everyone in England was creaming over in 2021 when the Super League news dropped. Essentially, it means fans have the controlling share, voting share, of the club. Of course, there's workarounds. Leverkusen and Wolfsburg gained exemption because they are inextricably linked to Bayer and Volkswagen, respectively, whilst Dietmar Hopp has enough of a link to Hoffenheim that he can skirt around it as well. Leipzig went another route entirely to circumvent the rules, just allowing 18 members all connected to Red Bull so that they would vote the way Red Bull intended anyway. Initially, locals were surprisingly not dead against it. Newspaper Leipziger Volkszeitung trotted out a poll which said 70% of their readership didn't mind the takeover actually. The rest of German football, less so. Here would follow Leipzig around, from Karl Zeiss Jena hurling things onto the pitch, Hallerscher pelting the team bus with stones, Heidenheim doing the same but with fake dollar bills instead of stones. As for Union Berlin, they simply sat in silence for the first 15 minutes of their first Bundesliga game in 2019 at the Alte Forsterei. If we went through all the protests, this video would be 7 hours long, so let's just move things along, shall we? RB Leipzig landed in the 5th tier, but thanks to being able to coax talent from far above their pay grade, they were promoted above who else but FSV Budisa Bautzen by 22 whole points. When they finally moved to the Red Bull Arena on the grounds of the Central Stadion, it turned out, just as it did in Salzburg and in New York, that simply chucking cash at a problem didn't make that problem go away. Just ask people like Ryan Giggs and Vince McMahon about NDAs. They were towards the top of their regional league but couldn't get promoted as chaos reigned behind the scenes. Dietmar Beiersdorfer and Thomas Linker were hired to control football operations, but Red Bull CEO Dietrich Mateschitz was persuaded to hand those duties to Peter Packult. Everyone fell like dominoes, Leipzig didn't go up and a change of tact was needed. It is in that summer of 2012 where we circle back to Ralf Rangnick. Within 2 years, Leipzig had gone from the 4th rung of the ladder to the 2nd one. Here's a Ralf Rangnick history lesson you can take to the bank. He was a jobbing amateur player in Stuttgart, and after a middle-of-the-road playing career, he caught his big break managing the youth and reserve Stuttgart sides, where he bumped into Valery Lobanovsky. The Ukrainian changed his life and set him down a path of the high press and relentless football. Here in the late 90s, German football was wedded to a sweeper system, so when Rangnick started carving up the tactical rulebooks with Ulm in the Zweite Bundesliga and appeared on national television, the country was not ready. Rangnick would be ridiculed, and short bursts at clubs like Hanover and Schalke wouldn't help the matter, no matter how successful he became. Finally, at Hoffenheim, he was given the total control that he had craved, and just like with Ulm, he set them on a path to bigger things. For Ulm at the start of the 2000s, it was bound for the Bundesliga. For Hoffenheim in the mid-2010s, Champions League. Now he was tasked with emulating those jobs with Red Bull, only from on high. This was the total control and less the day-to-day hassle that he needed. Under his employ, both Leipzig and Salzburg average ages were reduced drastically from 30 to 23. No longer were Red Bull hiring tired old players begging for a payday, but those younger and hungrier, like Joshua Kimmich, Yusuf Poulsen and Sadio Mane. It changed football as we knew it. If it was largely Salzburg cleaning up in the Austrian Bundesliga before Red Bull football was rerouted, what do you think happened after? Yeah, they won the league 10 years in a row and, in 8 of those seasons, scooped up the domestic double. Yet Salzburg had a massive problem, and it was called qualifying for the Champions League group stages. They were seemingly hell-bent on creating the funniest methods possible of not making the competition. In their first attempts, they got to within one tie before losing to teams like Valencia and Shakhtar Donetsk. Fair enough, you might say. Then it was being humbled 5-1 by Maccabi Haifa at the same stage in 2009. It was losing to their compatriots Hapoel Tel Aviv in 2010 before the ultimate indignity. An away goals defeat to Luxembourgish Dudelange at the first hurdle in 2012. This would relentlessly continue to Fenerbahce in the third qualifying round of 2013 before the twin devastations of Malmö in 2014 and 2015. It didn't matter that the coach was Roger Schmidt, Adi Hutter, Peter Ziedler or Oscar Garcia. It didn't matter that they armed themselves with a space-age training facility featuring machines named IntelliGym or local positioning measurement or even an anti-gravity running track. They just kept losing. At least they were competing now in the Europa League, losing to Villarreal in the last 32 in 2015 until they weren't, when Dynamo Minsk made them pay in qualifying later that year. For the big prize, they saw Croatians in Dynamo Zagreb and Rijeka trample over them. The pain was never ending. One successful branch in this hellacious forest was the work of Marco Rose for the youth team after he led Salzburg through an entertaining brand of football through the names of Manchester City, PSG, Atletico Madrid, Barcelona and Benfica to win the tournament. The future was bright, and even though Marco Rose had overseen that defeat to Rijeka after being promoted to the senior team, he nearly led them to replicating that 1994 UEFA Cup final that Red Bull wishes you'd forget about. They eventually fell to Marseille in the semi-finals in 2018, a team they'd taken 4 points off of in the group 6 months prior. It went on and on. Rose oversaw another qualification defeat against Red Star in 2018, and after being funnelled into the Europa League yet again, that little UEFA sore spot Giorgio Marchetti lumped both Leipzig and Salzburg into the same group. Just what on earth was football supposed to do now? Leipzig had gotten to this point with a strong core of young players, backed in defence by Marcel Halstenberg, Lucas Klostermann and Willy Orban, 2 of which still play for the club now, as the trio have made over a combined 800 appearances for Leipzig. They went up in 2016 after a Ralf Rangnick airdropping himself into the hot seat whilst they waited for Ralf Hasenhüttl, who deceptively only has one S in his name. They took the Bundesliga by storm, aided by the more flexible Austrian coach, who finished a distant second behind Bayern Munich. The incremental improvements kept coming. Paul Mitchell was hired to head up the Red Bull development after he had done the same at Southampton and Tottenham in England. But just like Salzburg had done, Leipzig struggled in their first steps in Europe, faltering in a seemingly kind hipster Champions League pool against Besiktas, Porto and Monaco. We narrowly avoided what threatened to be a cataclysmic semi-final between Leipzig and Salzburg thanks to Marseille, ending the Leipzig Europa League run in the quarter-finals, but we couldn't put it off any longer. In finishing 2 points off Champions League qualification, Leipzig found themselves paired off with Salzburg for 2 games in the Europa group stages, all because UEFA somehow managed to make themselves believe that the 2 clubs were actually independent of one another. In the past, they had been more inclined to deal with this head-on. They banned AEK Athens from the UEFA Cup in 1997 just in case they would draw Slavia Prague, who were owned by the same group. In 2001, Servette dropped out of the same competition so PSG could play in it. In 2018, UEFA said fuck it, let's try and ruin the fabric of football in another way. In the end, there wasn't much to worry about as personal pride took over and a decent first game gave way for Leipzig indifference in the second, as they had been already eliminated. For Salzburg, they'd returned to the last 16, losing out to Napoli, which meant they'd finally be guaranteed a group stage campaign in the Champions League when Austria's coefficient climbed them up to 11th, the romance of it all. Leipzig were supposed to be going onwards and upwards, armed with intelligent coaches, hungry players and a clear tramline to the Bundesliga title and Champions League knockouts. Yet Ralf Rangnick found himself back in the dugout after Hasenhüttl's contract was terminated a year early. It was a halfway house to the 32-year-old trendy Hoffenheim coach Julian Nagelsmann taking the job in 2019. He would be taking them on in the Champions League after Leipzig's freer schedule in the second half of the season was enough to return them to the Champions League, and this time we wouldn't get a Red Bull derby. Salzburg found themselves with Liverpool, Napoli and Genk across 6 games of no-pressure football, wowing audiences and introducing everyone, more importantly, to Erling Haaland. They'd impressed most of all in a 4-3 defeat at Anfield as their 6 matches generated 29 goals. For all the fun that was, Leipzig were on a real journey, topping another hipster group in Benfica, Lyon and Zenit. They'd reached the same stage as Lyon, not that anybody would have believed it in December. But by the time Champions League finished in August, the world was a very different place. After scaling a desperate Jose Mourinho and his Spurs team in the last 16 in March, Leipzig had to wait until August to complete their season amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. In a way, one-legged football aided Nagelsmann's team, especially so when faced off with the dark arts of Atletico Madrid. Tyler Adams' late winner meant Leipzig were 90 minutes away from a Champions League final against one of Bayern Munich or Lyon, only for them to run out of steam, losing 3-0 to PSG. But the era was already over. Ralf Rangnick had been in negotiations with Milan and was all but named manager. Then the club took an enormous U-turn on manager Stefano Pioli, and Rangnick took a step back from Red Bull in July 2020. For Rangnick, he'd be pulled through the ringer, coming to the attention of British eyes during his always doomed interim spell at Manchester United. Returning to Austria, he gifted them a first knockout stage in the Euros and has thus far been a success with players who will actually run for him. But what about Red Bull in his absence? And those are the modern hotbeds what Red Bull deem a roaring success. Hidden away are the Red Bull Ghanas and Red Bull Brazils that never got off the ground. Red Bull Bragantino are slowly climbing to the consciousness in Brazilian football, and whilst they've effectively taken over FC Liefering as a feeder club, the main story from Europe comes from Leeds United, a club that will simply not be allowed to be painted in Red Bull's colours or name merely as an investment tool. Perhaps that is the future of Red Bull football. In October, we got another inkling of the immediate future when Jurgen Klopp was named as their new head of global football. For innocent fans who believed that Klopp stood for everything morally that they did, it was pure outrage. But look at the history of the man. The football he played and governed, as well as the players he signed, the mantra that exists on the pitch of both Red Bull and Klopp, one of the same. It's probably just the Red Bull carpet bombing of every wrinkle and affectation in football that doesn't align. I'm sure things will iron themselves out. As for Leipzig, they've become an official part of the furniture in the Bundesliga. For as much as Bayer Leverkusen won the title unbeaten and Borussia Dortmund reached another Champions League final earlier this year, it is Leipzig who can boast to be the only club alongside Bayern Munich to have been in the top four for every season during the 20s. They turned Pokal defeats into victories in the subsequent 2 years over Freiburg and Frankfurt before making inroads on becoming a regular Champions League knockout team. It's just they keep getting handed these unfortunate draws by UEFA, when they're exiting in the last 16 against Liverpool, Manchester City and Real Madrid. Salzburg have become a Champions League knockout stage club too, if only briefly when they got their arse handed to them by Bayern Munich in the second leg of a last 16 tie in 2022. Whilst their seemingly domestic dominance has been ended by Sturm Graz, they have become a more regular Champions League fixture in recent years. So much so that they have qualified for the seemingly doomed and almost certainly ridiculous FIFA Club World Cup as part of UEFA's coefficient rankings. Wild. Red Bull dominate the youth scenes in Austria and America, hope to in Brazil, and they all feed towards Leipzig. And such is the food chain of modern football, their talent almost certainly winds up at the best teams in the world. Currently, Manchester City employ Erling Haaland and Josko Gvardiol. Dominic Szoboszlai and Ibrahima Konate play at Liverpool. Timo Werner's at Spurs. Christopher Nkunku's at Chelsea. Konrad Laimer, Dayot Upamecano and Joshua Kimmich at Bayern. Karim Adeyemi and Marcel Sabitzer at Dortmund are all IB products. Noah Okafor's at Milan. Ordi Mukiele plays for PSG, and Barca have hold of Dani Olmo. All this fuels the next wave of the production line, of which Benjamin Šeško, Xavi Simons, Lois Openda, Nicolas Seevald and Martin van den Voort exist. And it's because of this prolific academy system that the entire ecosystem keeps going. From talent factories in Mali, Ghana, Zambia and Ivory Coast in Africa, a base in Brazil and extensive knowledge of Central Europe. And not only footballers. Managers in the shape of Julian Nagelsmann, Marco Rose and Adi Hutter, among others, will continue to exist in managerial conversations at the top end of European football for the next generation. It helps that their collective style of football has become the product of the footballing zeitgeist, to use a German word. Success for these clubs will never be a fairy tale, as they are effectively new organisations built from the ground up with the speed of some junkie with Red Bull for blood has been able to outmaneuver the slow-moving sloths of UEFA, FIFA and IFAB. The horse has now bolted, where we now consume football more than anything, where we sit and watch conglomerates of billionaires move people from one of their clubs to another, not just in Leipzig, Salzburg or New York, but in Manchester, Catalonia, London, Strasbourg or Melbourne. The paranoia, the conspiracy, that will always continue, and billionaire owners will always be surrounded by quicker and smarter people than those who represent the tradition of football leagues and its governing bodies. For now, the traditions hold on for the most part. Bayern Munich, Real Madrid, Barcelona, Liverpool and Arsenal still exist at the top table. It'll only take something so obvious, so egregious to stop the latest powers of Manchester City, Paris Saint-Germain and Leipzig to rise to the top as this new tradition. Want a more organic and uplifting story of football success? Look no further than our video on Union Berlin.